At Thanksgiving dinner, my dad stood up and announced, "We're selling the family business and you're getting nothing." The room went silent, forks dropped, and my world shattered. I built that company beside him, and that day, I swore he'd regret forgetting who helped build his empire. Quick, hit like, share with your friends, and subscribe. This story is about to get intense. I remember that Thanksgiving like it was etched in slow motion, every moment stretching longer than time itself, every sound sharper than reality had any right to be. The house smelled of roasted turkey, caramelized onions, and the faint, lingering trace of my mother's cinnamon pies. But that warmth did nothing to soften the tension I could feel creeping beneath the surface. The sunlight filtered through the windows, late afternoon light streaking across the hardwood floors, making the dust motes dance like tiny specters in the air. Outside, the bare trees rattled in a chilly wind, and I remember thinking how absurd it was, how ordinary everything seemed, just hours before my world was about to fracture. I had spent the morning in the kitchen, slicing vegetables and basting the turkey with the same meticulous care I had put into building the family business, side by side with my father for nearly a decade. Every detail mattered. Every little adjustment could be the difference between perfection and mediocrity. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter, clinking dishes, and casual conversation, yet beneath it all, I sensed a fragile tension in my father's eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. He wasn't the man to sit quietly, but that day there was a peculiar stillness about him. My siblings were scattered around the table, their conversations light and teasing, completely unaware of the storm gathering in our midst. I caught glimpses of my sister's manicured hands as she twirled a napkin absent-mindedly, and my brother kept tapping his fork impatiently against his plate, already bored with the small talk. The way they moved, the way the room smelled, the very way the sunlight caught on the edges of the silverware, it all seemed to slow down in that surreal, cinematic way, like the world itself was pausing to witness what was about to unfold. And then he stood, my father. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but it carried with it the weight of an impending storm. The conversation faltered mid-laughter, forks paused in midair, and a silence thick enough to taste descended over the room. He straightened his shoulders, a practiced posture that had always conveyed authority, and I remember thinking for a fleeting second that perhaps he was just about to make a toast, a banal celebration of family and gratitude. But the words that fell from his lips shattered any semblance of normalcy. "We're selling the family business, and you're getting nothing." The world went silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, hammering in my ears louder than any conversation. I wanted to move, to shout, to ask him what he meant, but my body refused to obey. My fork fell from my hand and clattered against the plate, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden vacuum of sound. The people around me froze in disbelief. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her napkin, her mouth opening to speak, but no words coming out. My siblings stared at him as if trying to decipher a language they didn't understand, their expressions a mix of shock, confusion, and something darker, betrayal. I felt my stomach drop, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing I had no choice but to fall. Every memory of the years I had spent working beside him, the late nights negotiating deals, the endless problem solving, the sacrifices I had made, rushed into my mind in a chaotic flood. I had given him everything I had, and now, in a single sentence, he had erased it all. I couldn't move. My throat was dry. My father's gaze swept the room, and for the first time, I saw a glint of something I'd never noticed before: satisfaction. A cruel, deliberate satisfaction. The kind that doesn't come from business triumphs or wealth, but from the sheer power of hurting someone who trusted you completely. "You're joking," I whispered, almost inaudibly, though my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. He didn't respond. His eyes were calm, detached, and in that detachment, I saw the magnitude of the betrayal. I wanted to scream, to throw the nearest object, to tear through the room and expose the injustice of it all. But I couldn't. I was trapped in shock, watching the world tilt on its axis. My father sat back down, picking up his napkin with a casualness that made my blood boil, as if he had just made a routine announcement about the weather. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze. Words were spoken, some angry, some pleading, but everything felt muted, filtered through a layer of disbelief so thick it was almost suffocating. I remember catching glimpses of my mother's tears, my siblings' silent fury, and the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain, each sound punctuating the impossible reality. That night, I didn't sleep. I wandered the empty halls of the house, touching the walls, the furniture, anything that might ground me in a reality that no longer felt like mine. I thought about the business, the countless deals, the years of blood, sweat, and tears I'd poured into it. And then I thought about him, my father, the man who had taught me everything I knew, who had raised me, who had shaped the person I had become. And yet, in one moment, he had become unrecognizable, a stranger cloaked in the guise of family. By the time dawn broke, I had made a decision. The anger that had once threatened to consume me had transformed into something sharper, more precise: determination. He had underestimated me, he had miscalculated. And if he thought that selling the business and cutting me out of it would break me, he was gravely mistaken. I spent the next weeks in quiet calculation. Every meeting I had attended with him, every conversation, every contract, every handshake, I dissected them all, looking for leverage, for weakness. I remembered every time he had dismissed my suggestions, every time he had taken credit for something I had executed flawlessly, and slowly, deliberately, a plan began to take shape. Not out of spite, though there was plenty of that, but out of a relentless drive to reclaim what was rightfully mine, to show him, in a way that words could never convey, that forgetting who had built the empire with him would be his gravest mistake. The first step was understanding the sale itself. I dug into the numbers, scrutinized the buyers, analyzed the contracts. Every detail mattered. Every minor oversight was an opportunity. I'd always been meticulous, and now that precision became my weapon. I spent long nights in the office, the glow of the computer screen illuminating a face hardened by betrayal and resolve. I barely ate, barely slept, consumed by a single thought: reversal, redemption, revenge. And then came the first twist. Just when I thought I had mapped out every angle, discovered every vulnerability, I found something unexpected buried deep in the contracts, a clause, obscure and nearly invisible, that changed everything. It wasn't just a technicality, it was a key, a doorway to reclaiming not just the business, but my own sense of justice. The discovery sent a shiver down my spine, equal parts exhilaration and fear, because with every door comes risk, and this door led to consequences I had yet to fully understand. That realization marked the beginning of the game of patience, strategy, and carefully wielded power. My father had thrown the first punch, but I was about to rewrite the rules entirely. And as I stood in the dim glow of my office, alone except for the hum of the city outside, I felt a thrill I hadn't known in years. For the first time since that Thanksgiving, I felt alive in a way that was terrifying and intoxicating. This was no longer just about money or recognition. It was about legacy, about proof, about forcing him to remember, in the most irrevocable way possible, that an empire is never built by a single hand. And as I began to plan, sketching strategies and contingencies, I realized the first step was simple: patience. Wait, observe, and strike when the moment was least expected, when the shock would be absolute. And so the stage was set. I had been cast in a role I had never auditioned for, the one who would reclaim everything lost, the one who would turn betrayal into triumph, the one who would expose not just his arrogance, but the fragility hidden beneath the empire he so proudly displayed. I didn't yet know how far I would go, or how dark the path would become. But one thing was certain: he had underestimated me. He had forgotten. And that, above all else, would be his undoing. I spent the next few days in a strange limbo, moving through the motions of life while my mind was entirely elsewhere. On the surface, I kept the same routines, the same polite smiles, the same casual nods when neighbors passed by. I even went through the motions of family dinners, sitting quietly, listening, pretending to laugh at jokes that no longer held humor for me. But underneath, I was calculating, observing, cataloging every nuance of behavior, every weakness, every crack in the facade that had once seemed impenetrable. The office became my sanctuary. I would arrive before dawn, long before anyone else, when the building was silent except for the low hum of the heating system and the occasional distant rumble of city traffic. I would pore over financial statements, shareholder agreements, and confidential emails, tracing every line, every clause, every overlooked detail. It was tedious work, but I found a grim satisfaction in it. Each small revelation was like a spark in the dark, illuminating a path forward. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the office in a dim orange glow, I came across something that made my pulse quicken. It wasn't a glaring loophole or a glaring error. It was subtle, almost hidden, tucked away in the fine print of the sale agreement. The buyers had assumed they were acquiring the entirety of the company, unencumbered by any internal disputes. They hadn't accounted for the way ownership had been legally structured, the minor yet critical clauses that I had insisted on years ago during a particularly stubborn negotiation. I leaned back in my chair, eyes wide, heart racing. For the first time since that Thanksgiving, I felt a surge of hope and a corresponding surge of adrenaline. I realized that the very contract my father had signed, the one he had wielded like a weapon against me, could also be used to dismantle the deal entirely. If handled correctly, with careful precision, I could not just reclaim what was taken, but seize control in a way that would leave him scrambling to understand what had happened. But this wasn't a game to be rushed. I reminded myself of that constantly. Patience was key. One wrong move and everything could collapse. The thrill was intoxicating, but I knew I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. Every interaction with my father had to be calculated, every word measured. I became a ghost in the house, appearing only when necessary, observing his routines, noting his habits, his moods, the subtle tells that betrayed when he was confident and when he was vulnerable. Weeks passed. The tension in the house was palpable, though unspoken. My father seemed to relish the control he believed he had. He would casually drop comments at the dinner table about finalizing the sale or moving on to new ventures, always watching for a reaction. I gave none. I kept my face neutral, my voice calm. But inside, I was building a map, a blueprint of his arrogance, a catalog of every misstep. And then came the first move. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it shifted the balance in ways my father would never anticipate. I reached out to a former client, someone my father had dealt with directly, and reminded them of an outstanding obligation that had been ignored. The client was taken aback, not by my inquiry, but by the precision and authority in my tone. Within days, the issue that my father had assumed would be swept under the rug was resolved, giving me an unexpected advantage. A small victory, perhaps, but in the game I was playing, small victories were everything. As I orchestrated these moves behind the scenes, I began to notice a subtle change in my father. It wasn't overt, but in the way he spoke to employees, in the slight hesitation before he made a decision, in the faintest crease in his brow, I saw cracks forming in the armor he had so carefully maintained. It thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. Thrilled because the path forward was clearer, terrified because the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. One night, I returned to the office long after the sun had set, the city lights twinkling like distant stars below. I pored over old contracts, tracing lines back years, looking for any other weaknesses, any overlooked advantage. The office was silent except for the faint tapping of my fingers on the keyboard and the occasional distant siren. Then I saw it, a forgotten clause buried in the original partnership agreement, one that my father had overlooked in his haste to control the business. It was obscure, legalistic, almost laughable in its insignificance if taken out of context. But in the context I understood, it was a key. It could invalidate parts of the sale, give me leverage over the buyers, and potentially allow me to reclaim control entirely. I sat back in my chair, staring at the document, feeling a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. I had expected to find opportunities, sure, but this was more than an opportunity, and it was a weapon. And like all weapons, it had to be wielded carefully. One misstep, and everything could come crashing down, leaving me with nothing. I realized as I sat there in the quiet glow of the computer screen that this was no longer just about reclaiming the business. It was about proving something to him, about showing him in the most irrevocable way possible that underestimating me had been his gravest mistake. The next few weeks became a delicate dance. I moved invisibly, setting pieces in place, manipulating outcomes without revealing my hand. I met discreetly with lawyers, former clients, and even employees who had once been overlooked or dismissed. Each conversation, each subtle suggestion, each carefully timed action built toward a crescendo that my father would never see coming. And then came the night that changed everything. I had arranged a meeting with one of the buyers under the pretense of discussing minor contractual clarifications. In reality, I had prepared a detailed presentation outlining the legal oversights, the internal discrepancies, and the clauses that could nullify the sale entirely. I spoke calmly, methodically, showing the evidence, presenting the strategy. The buyers were taken aback, initially defensive, then cautiously intrigued. And finally, they began to see the logic in my plan. By the time I left the meeting, the outcome was certain. The sale was in jeopardy. My father, who had assumed everything was settled, had no idea the foundation of his victory was crumbling beneath him. Returning home that night, I felt a surge of both triumph and dread. The power dynamic had shifted, but the battle was far from over. I could feel the tension in the house thickening, my father growing restless, suspicious. He had no idea that every move he made, every word he spoke, every confident smile was being cataloged, analyzed, and countered. The quiet war had begun. In the following days, the atmosphere became electric. My father was sharper, more aggressive, more insistent that the sale must proceed as planned. I played my role perfectly, offering support, feigning compliance, and allowing him to believe he was still in control. Yet every interaction was a chess move, every word a calculated piece on the board, and then an unexpected twist. One of my father's most trusted advisors, someone he had relied on for years, approached me in secret. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. "You need to know," he whispered. "He's making mistakes, bigger mistakes than you realize, but you have to be careful. He's dangerous when cornered." I nodded, carefully neutral. Inside, a thrill ran through me. The path forward was clearer than ever, but the warning was a reminder of the stakes. My father was not just stubborn or arrogant. He was unpredictable, and unpredictability could be lethal in the wrong hands. But I was ready. I had prepared for this. Every contingency, every potential backlash, every risk had been considered. The days that followed were a tense, silent war. My father moved like a predator, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, trying to anticipate my strategy. I countered invisibly, subtly, carefully, ensuring that every action he took would lead him closer to the trap I had set. The house itself seemed to pulse with attention, the air thick with unspoken conflict. Every glance, every gesture, every word carried weight, and then, just as the pieces were aligning perfectly, the final revelation struck. It wasn't something I'd planned for, something I'd overlooked in my meticulous preparation. A hidden element within the sale agreement, a clause so obscure, so cleverly buried, that even I had almost missed it. It changed everything, opening possibilities I hadn't imagined, and adding layers of complexity that made the stakes even higher. I realized then, as I stared at the document in disbelief, that this game, the game of reclaiming the empire, of proving my worth, of confronting betrayal, was far more intricate than I had ever anticipated. The path ahead was dangerous, unpredictable, and yet irresistibly compelling. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. The final confrontation, the ultimate revelation, was still to come. But I also knew one thing with absolute clarity. When it happened, when the truth was finally exposed, my father would understand, in a way he never had before, the consequences of forgetting who had built the empire with him. And I would make sure he did. By the time the first hints of winter crept through the city streets, a thin layer of frost glinting on the car windows and the edges of the sidewalks, I had settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. My father had begun to sense the change, the subtle shifts in the balance of power, but He couldn't quite place them. He moved with caution now, testing the waters with an intensity that betrayed his growing unease. I had become invisible in plain sight, a silent storm gathering strength while he remained oblivious to the true depth of my plan. One evening, as I lingered in the office, long after the sun had vanished beneath the horizon, I watched the city lights flicker like distant stars, reflecting in the polished surface of the desk. My phone vibrated, a brief, almost trivial disturbance in the otherwise perfect silence. It was a message from the advisor who had first tipped me off about my father's errors. A cryptic note. He suspects something. Be ready. Timing is everything. I felt a shiver run down my spine, equal parts thrill and caution. Timing was indeed everything. A single misstep and the entire plan, every painstakingly calculated move could crumble. I knew the moment of confrontation was approaching, and I had to be prepared. Not just for him, but for the chaos that would inevitably follow. The next morning, I arrived at the house under the pretense of a routine visit, carrying a file of documents that I had ostensibly discovered during my independent research. The sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the dust in the corners and giving the entire room a surreal, almost cinematic glow. My father was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spotted me. The tension between us had become palpable, a silent electric current that seemed to hum in the air. "Morning," he said, voice casual but sharp, as if measuring my reaction. "Morning," I replied evenly, sliding the file across the counter without meeting his gaze. "I've been reviewing some old contracts. Found a few discrepancies you might want to look at." He raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Discrepancies? Or are you looking for a way to stir trouble?" I let a pause hang in the air, letting the tension stretch between us like a drawn bowstring. "Depends on how you define trouble," I said softly, almost innocently. But inside, I was calculating every possible reaction, every micro expression that could betray his thoughts. For the next hour, we went through the documents together. My father's demeanor shifted subtly, his casual arrogance giving way to caution then suspicion. Every question he asked, every comment he made was an attempt to gauge my intentions. But I stayed calm, methodical, revealing just enough information to seem cooperative, withholding everything that truly mattered. By the time he finally left the office, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already beginning to take root. He didn't yet know how deep the rabbit hole went, and that ignorance was my advantage. That night, I returned to the office, poring over the contracts and financial records until the glow of the computer screen was the only light in the room. My mind was a whirlwind of calculations, strategies, and contingencies. Every path, every potential outcome had to be mapped. Every move he could make had to be anticipated and countered. It was exhausting, yet intoxicating. Then came the first confrontation that wasn't silent, that wasn't veiled in subtlety. I had received a call from one of the buyers, the first official acknowledgement that the sale was in jeopardy. They had reviewed the documents, understood the leverage I held, and wanted assurances. I agreed to meet them under the guise of negotiation and prepared meticulously. Every word, every gesture, every nuance had to convey control, authority, and credibility. The meeting took place in a small conference room, the walls lined with dark wood, the air thick with the faint scent of polished leather and coffee. The buyers arrived, their expressions guarded, wary of deception. I laid out the facts calmly, showing the legal oversights, the discrepancies, the clauses that could invalidate portions of the sale. I spoke with precision, anticipating every question, countering every objection before it was voiced. By the end of the meeting, the buyers were swayed. They understood that proceeding without addressing these issues was a risk they could not afford. The power dynamic had shifted decisively, and the realization sent a thrill through me. But I also knew this was only the beginning. My father, who had believed he was untouchable, would react, predictably, emotionally, and recklessly. Sure enough, within days, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. His confidence, once unshakable, began to falter. He questioned employees more aggressively, made decisions hastily, and displayed flashes of impatience that were out of character. The tension in the house became almost tangible, an unspoken war waging in every glance, every movement, every word spoken. One evening, as I walked through the hallways, I overheard a heated conversation between my father and one of his advisors. He was furious, pacing back and forth, his voice rising. How is this even possible? We had this deal finalized. Everything was supposed to be done. I paused, leaning against the doorway, listening. Every word, every inflection, every tremor in his voice was a piece of the puzzle. I felt a dark satisfaction, but also a growing sense of urgency. The closer I came to reclaiming the empire, the higher the stakes became. The following week, I initiated the next phase of my plan. I began meeting discreetly with key employees, those who had once been overlooked or dismissed by my father. I spoke to them not just as an authority figure, but as someone who understood the business from the ground up. I reminded them of their contributions, their loyalty, and their frustrations. Slowly, I began to build a coalition, a network of allies who recognized the potential for change and were willing to act when the moment came. It was delicate work. One misstep could expose my intentions and provoke my father into retaliation. But the more I engaged with these employees, the more I realized something I hadn't anticipated. Loyalty was not a simple commodity. It was layered, complex, and deeply tied to respect. By acknowledging their value, I not only gained allies, I earned their trust, their confidence, and their willingness to follow my lead. Then came an unexpected complication. One of my father's most loyal executives, someone I had counted on to remain neutral, approached me privately. His eyes were wary, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know who to trust anymore, he admitted. If he finds out you're working against him, I placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, reassuring. I won't let that happen. But you have to understand, this isn't just about power. It's about justice, about correcting mistakes that were overlooked for too long. He nodded slowly, uncertainty lingering, but the seed of trust had been planted. And in that moment, I realized the true power of influence. Not force, not aggression, but the ability to inspire confidence and loyalty in those around you. Days turned into weeks. The battle was no longer silent. It had moved into the open, though my father remained unaware of the full extent. Every interaction was a test, every decision, a potential tipping point. I began to see the cracks widen in his empire, subtle but undeniable. Projects stalled, negotiations faltered, and employees began to question his authority. The consequences of underestimating me were becoming evident. One night, I stayed late in the office, reviewing every possible scenario, every contingency. My mind was a labyrinth of strategy, anticipation, and calculated risk. And then, amid the stacks of documents and glowing screens, I came across a final revelation, something that changed the trajectory entirely. It was an overlooked financial agreement, buried deep in the company's archives, one that gave me legal leverage far beyond what I had imagined. The implications were staggering. Not only could I challenge the sale effectively, I could assert control in a way that would be both indisputable and irreversible. I leaned back in my chair, the room spinning slightly as the weight of realization sank in. The game had shifted. The stakes were higher than ever. My father, who had believed himself untouchable, was about to face consequences he could never have anticipated. And yet, with this power came a chilling clarity. The final confrontation would not be simple. It would be messy, unpredictable, and potentially destructive. I had to prepare for every eventuality, every emotional reaction, every desperate attempt to reclaim control. The stage was set. Every piece was in place. And I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the moment of reckoning, the moment where betrayal met justice, was imminent. The night of the confrontation arrived with a calm that was almost unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. Snow had begun to fall outside, thin flakes drifting lazily against the darkened windows, and the street lamps cast a cold, amber glow over the quiet city. I had spent the day reviewing every detail, rehearsing every word I might say, every move I might make. My hands were steady, my mind sharp, but beneath the control there was a tension I couldn't shake. This was the culmination of months of planning, calculation, and quiet manipulation. The final act. I arrived at the house before anyone else, slipping in through the back entrance to avoid notice. The interior was still warm, the remnants of dinner lingering faintly in the air, but there was a tension in the household that made it almost suffocating. My father was pacing in the living room when I entered, hands behind his back, shoulders stiff. His expression was a mixture of irritation and apprehension, an uncharacteristic vulnerability that gave me a small, grim satisfaction. "I see you've been busy," he said, his tone measured, cautious. "I hear whispers about deals, clients, employees. What exactly are you doing?" I leaned casually against the doorway, letting a faint smile tug at my lips. "Just making sure everything's in order. You know how I am. I like things tidy." My words were calm, almost innocuous, but beneath the surface, every syllable was designed to unsettle, to hint at the power I now wielded. He didn't respond immediately, instead studying me like a general assessing an opponent. The silence stretched, long and heavy, until I felt my pulse quicken. Finally, he spoke, his voice tighter now, edged with frustration. "You think you can undo what's been done? That you can just rewrite everything?" I pushed off the doorway and stepped closer, meeting his gaze directly. "I don't think. I know." There was no hesitation in my voice, no doubt. The certainty in my words seemed to flicker something in his eyes, something that was rarely visible, a hint of fear. We moved through the house, our conversation a careful dance of accusation, deflection, and revelation. I presented the first evidence: minor discrepancies, overlooked clauses, and inconsistencies that had already begun to disrupt the sale. His reaction was a flicker of controlled panic, quickly masked by a mask of arrogance. But the cracks were there. They had always been there, and now they were widening. As the night wore on, the tension escalated. My father's questions became sharper, more insistent, and his demeanor shifted from controlled irritation to something raw, exposed. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the desperate attempts to predict my strategy, to anticipate the next move. But I had anticipated that. Every step, every interaction, every revelation had been planned to corner him, to force him into a position where he had no options left. And then, the first twist. One of the buyers called mid-confrontation, and I handed the phone to him without comment. His confusion was immediate. The conversation on the line was terse, professional, and cold. They had reviewed the documents I had presented, confirmed the legal leverage I held, and indicated that unless the sale was renegotiated on my terms, the entire deal could collapse. My father's face paled, the color draining as he realized the magnitude of the situation. "You," he started, voice trembling slightly, but I cut him off. "You underestimated me. You assumed that loyalty, that obedience, that silence would last forever. You assumed that forgetting who built the company with you would go unpunished." His jaw tightened, and for the first time in my life, I saw anger, bordering on fear in his eyes. He had faced market collapses, business failures, and legal threats before, but nothing had ever caught him so off guard. Nothing had ever placed him so entirely at my mercy. The confrontation intensified over the following hours. I revealed each calculated move. The coalition of employees who now operated under my quiet guidance, the advisory connections I had leveraged, and the legal precedents I had unearthed. Each revelation was like a carefully aimed strike, weakening his defenses, destabilizing his control. By now, the house was thick with tension, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken truths. The fire in the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the walls, echoing the dance of power and betrayal unfolding in the room. And then came the final twist, the revelation that neither of us had anticipated. As I presented the ultimate leverage, a clause buried so deep in the original agreements that even I had almost missed it. My father's face contorted with shock, then disbelief. "No, this can't be," he muttered, stumbling over the words as if the very foundation of his empire were crumbling beneath him. "Yes," I said softly, almost tenderly, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. "It can, and it will. This isn't about revenge, it's about reality, about consequences, about remembering what or who built this empire. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was oppressive, almost deafening. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the subtle crackle of the fireplace, the unsteady rhythm of our own breathing. Then, finally, he spoke, voice low, almost a whisper. I, I didn't think. You didn't think, I finished for him, letting the words hang. And that was your mistake. The aftermath was a mixture of resignation, chaos, and revelation. My father sat, shoulders slumping, the weight of realization settling on him. The buyers, now aware of the legal leverage I held, had agreed to renegotiate on my terms, effectively handing me control. The employees, witnessing the shift, became quietly loyal, their faith in me now unshakable. And I, standing amidst the flickering firelight, felt the full measure of months of strategy, patience, and psychological warfare come to fruition. But the story didn't end there. In the quiet that followed, I discovered one final shocking revelation. Hidden within the company's financials was a series of transactions, subtle and almost invisible, that pointed to something my father had never intended anyone to see. Embezzlement, misappropriation of funds. Not massive, but enough to shatter reputations, enough to ensure that his decisions would now carry consequences far beyond the boardroom. I held the documents in my hands, staring at the numbers, the names, the trails of deceit. It was almost poetic justice. The empire he had built, maintained through manipulation and control, now teetering on the edge because of the very arrogance that had led him to underestimate me. I looked at him, seated in the leather armchair by the fire, eyes hollow but defiant. You built an empire, I said quietly. But you forgot one thing. Empires aren't built by one person alone. And when you forget that, when you betray those who stood beside you, the consequences, they follow. He didn't respond. Perhaps there were no words left, or perhaps the weight of the truth was too much to bear. The room seemed suspended in time, the flickering light casting long shadows, highlighting every wrinkle, every crease, every expression etched with regret. And then, as I turned to leave, to step into the new reality I had carved, I caught one last detail, something I had overlooked until that very moment. The financial discrepancies weren't just mistakes, they were intentional, part of a deeper scheme that implicated others outside the family. My father wasn't the only one responsible. There were players, unseen and powerful, whose interests had intersected with ours in ways I hadn't anticipated. The realization hit me like a cold wind. The story was far from over. The confrontation had been decisive, yes, but the ramifications, the alliances, the consequences would continue to ripple outward, far beyond the walls of our house, far beyond the reach of the empire itself. I stepped out into the falling snow, letting the cold bite at my cheeks, letting the silence of the night surround me. The city stretched out below, vast and indifferent, unaware of the small yet seismic shifts that had just occurred within one family. And in that quiet, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I had won, in the immediate sense. The empire was no longer his alone, and the betrayal had been avenged. But the larger game, the one of power, loyalty, and consequence, was only just beginning. And as I walked through the snow, leaving the house and the past behind, I realized that some revelations are never truly final. Some consequences ripple outward, unpredictable and unstoppable, shaping futures in ways even the most calculated mind cannot anticipate. And in that moment, I understood the final truth. The empire, the betrayal, the victory. They were never just about business. They were about legacy, about the fragile and dangerous architecture of trust, power, and human ambition. And in the end, the only certainty was that the world would never be the same, and neither would we. The days after the confrontation were surreal. The house felt different, heavier, quieter, haunted by an invisible tension that neither my father nor I could entirely dispel. The firelight no longer flickered across the walls in a dance of shadows. It seemed steadier now, casting a harsh light that exposed the reality we had both been forced to confront. The empire, once a fortress of my father's pride and arrogance, had shifted under my hands, reshaped by patience, strategy, and a relentless refusal to be forgotten. But the victory, though real, carried with it an unexpected emptiness. Standing in the boardroom as the final contracts were signed, my name officially recognized, the company legally transferred under my authority, I felt a hollow triumph. The employees' quiet loyalty was gratifying, but the warmth of familial connection was absent. My father sat across from me, eyes hard, lips pressed in a thin line. Pride and resentment wrestled visibly on his face. He had lost control, but he had not lost entirely. His presence, his influence, still lingered in the corners of every decision, every legacy, every memory. The shocking revelation that had emerged during the confrontation weighed heavily on my mind. The hidden financial manipulations weren't just evidence of poor judgment, they were a warning, a reminder that power, when untempered by ethics, always carries consequences. I began retracing every step of the company's history, uncovering layers of deceit, mismanagement, and self interest that had been buried beneath the facade of success. Every document, every agreement, every handshake told a story not of triumph, but of compromise, of ambition, overriding conscience. My father, meanwhile, retreated into silence. He no longer spoke with the authority he once wielded so effortlessly. His movements were calculated, cautious, yet I could see glimpses of a man grappling with the magnitude of what had happened. There were moments when his eyes met mine, and in that glance, I caught a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret, but it was fleeting, buried beneath the layers of ego and pride that had defined him for decades. I, too, felt the weight of transformation. Months of planning, of psychological strategy, of careful manipulation had changed me irrevocably. I was no longer simply the son who had built alongside his father. I was a strategist, a leader, someone who had learned how to bend circumstances to his will without losing sight of the consequences. Yet, even as I celebrated the legal and corporate victory, I couldn't escape a gnawing question. At what cost? One afternoon, I walked the halls of the office alone, the city beyond the windows a blur of motion and light. I paused in front of a photograph of the company's early days, taken long before ambition had twisted into competition, before betrayal had entered our lives. I remembered the long nights, the shared victories, the sense of purpose that had once united us. And I realized something profound. The empire was mine now, but the man I had once called father, mentor, partner, ally was a stranger. The foundation we had built together remained, yet the personal bond had been fractured, perhaps irreparably. Then came the final revelation, the one I had not anticipated. Hidden in a set of old emails I had uncovered while reviewing the company's archives was evidence of a deliberate plan my father had kept secret, not just to sell the business, but to protect it from outside threats, from competitors, even from me. The embezzlement, the mismanagement, the manipulations, they had been calculated, strategic, part of a protective measure to shield the company from forces I hadn't considered. My father hadn't acted purely out of arrogance or malice. There had been foresight, a willingness to take personal and professional risks to safeguard something larger than himself. The truth hit me like a punch to the chest. For all my careful planning, all my strategy, all my victories, there had been a dimension I had never fully understood: intention. Actions that seemed cruel or reckless were, in some twisted logic, acts of preservation. I had fought to reclaim what I believed was stolen, only to discover that the line between betrayal and protection was far thinner, far more ambiguous than I had ever realized. I confronted him again, quietly, in the office after everyone else had left. The snow outside had turned to a gentle rain, streaking the windows with liquid silver. He looked at me, eyes weary but resolute. "You've won," he said simply, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "But do you understand why I did it?" I met his gaze, struggling to reconcile anger, admiration, and disbelief. "I understand that you made choices," I said carefully, "but I don't know if I understand the reasons, or if I ever will." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps you will, with time. Perhaps not. But know this: every empire has shadows, every victory comes with cost, and every betrayal is born from something deeper than you might see at first glance." The weight of his words lingered long after he left. I sat at my desk, staring at the glow of the computer screen, at the city beyond, at the empire that was mine. And I realized that victory was not an endpoint. It was a threshold, a beginning of a new chapter, one filled with responsibility, reflection, and unforeseen consequences. In the quiet that followed, I reflected on the journey, the betrayal, the strategy, the revelations, the twists that had reshaped everything I had believed about family, loyalty, and ambition. I understood now that power was never purely about authority or control. It was about understanding human complexity, navigating moral ambiguity, and reconciling the personal with the professional. And perhaps most importantly, it was about recognizing that every action, no matter how justified, carries weight beyond immediate perception. As I looked out the rain streaked window, the city lights reflected in the wet streets, I asked myself questions I knew I would return to again and again. Could I have achieved victory without fracturing the bond with my father? Was my sense of justice the same as morality, or simply my own measure of right and wrong? In claiming the empire, had I preserved the legacy, or had I merely rewritten history in my own image? I realized in that quiet cinematic moment that the answers were not simple. They were layered, complex, and deeply personal, shaped by experience, emotion, and the choices we make under pressure. The story, though concluded in terms of conflict, was far from over in its implications. Each decision, each revelation, each act of strategy carried forward into an uncertain future where the true measure of legacy would be determined not by conquest, but by wisdom, reflection, and the ability to navigate the shadows left in the wake of ambition. And so I leave the story here, not as an ending, but as a mirror for reflection. For those watching, for those listening, I ask, how far would you go to reclaim what you believe is rightfully yours? Can betrayal ever be fully justified by intention? And when the lines between loyalty, ambition, and morality blur, how do you know which path leads to true victory and which leaves only ruin in its wake? The empire stands, the battle is won, but the questions linger, haunting, persistent, and unavoidable. And perhaps in the answers, we find not closure, but the next chapter of the story we all carry within ourselves.